Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you could make time today. We have been thinking about how to serve our community of small and medium businesses better. And one of the things we wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about how to think about supply chain and cross-border trade in the time of COVID-19, and give some insights about it. So with all the challenges that we're facing in global trade today, many business owners, are wondering, is conducting cross-border trade reliable right now? They're asking, will my business be disrupted if I try to ship things from China? Mostly just when can I get back to business as usual? And these are obviously very important questions. And the team at Alibaba have been working hard to help people around the world get connected to the products, partners, and capital that they need to run their business. And so some of the considerations that we are thinking about with them are, supply chain transparency is more important than ever right now. There are many places that where things can go wrong in the supply chain more than ever. And the second thing is knowing that you've got a fair and final price on logistics is very challenging. And thirdly, we've had massive cancellations in the air market. And so it's very challenging to figure out how to get availability and how to manage pricing. Do you have a fair price? And do you have options? So these are things that we are thinking about, and we wanted to share some of our insights on that. But perhaps before I go further, it would be helpful to give a little bit of an overview on Alibaba. So Alibaba has been in business for 20 years and has been creating tools and services to enable global trade. Our mission is to make it easy to do business anywhere. We're an online B2B wholesale e-commerce platform, and we serve businesses of all sizes and nearly every industry you can imagine. The platform is global. We connect buyers and sellers from most of the major countries in the world. And, in the past several years, we've been working hard to build trade enablement services. There was a time when we were just doing the matching, but now we're actually facilitating trade between buyers and sellers. And that includes payments and financing and a lot of and shipping services, as well as other things. So that's a little bit of an update of who we are and what we've been doing. One of the services that we've seen many customers moving towards in the past few weeks is digital freight, and this addresses many of the issues that arise from a disrupted supply chain, specifically around transparency and price comparison and just overall optionality. So services like this put control of cross-border trade back in the hands of business owners without the complexity that is so common in traditional freight. So we've seen a big shift in our customers towards these types of services. And it gives you, more visibility on pricing and different choices about how to bring your goods into the country. Today, we have asked our friends at Freightos to tell you more about what's happening in the global freight market. Freightos is a pioneer in digitized freight services, and I'm very excited to have them here to share why now is a good time to start getting back to business as usual. First, we have Judah Levine, and then we have Ari Corman, and they're going to share some things about what they've learned in the freight industry. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Judah.
Thanks a lot, Jamin. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of really what the story has been of the COVID-19 impact on the freight industry and on logistics thus far. So we move to the next slide, please. So the story of COVID-19's impact on freight and logistics is really a story of different swings in supply and demand. So the graph we're looking at now is from our Freightos Baltic Index, or the FBX, which is an index of containerized ocean freight rates or freight prices. And this is an example of rates for China to the US West Coast this is price per 40-foot container over time. So, and this is a really good reflection of supply for China. If we start on the left side of the graph, we're looking at January of this year. We see that prices were high, which means that demand for freight coming out of China before Chinese New Year was high. Then we see as Chinese New Year came and then COVID started having impact in China, that prices dipped as China was shut down and manufacturing was on pause. But once manufacturing picked up in early March, indications are that Chinese manufacturing has nearly completely recovered, with Hubei province being the exception. And even there are steps already being taken towards normalcy. So as we saw Chinese manufacturing recovers, we see this spike towards the right-hand side of our graph. So the spike in prices reflects again this spike in demand for U.S. shippers to get orders out of China as Chinese manufacturing recovered. So we see this spike as U.S. importers before COVID-19 is really spreading and having itself impacting the economy there. U.S. importers were rushing to get orders out of China and replenish inventories. But since then, and now we're towards like the last quarter of our graph on the right-hand side. So in the last few weeks, really since mid-March, as COVID-19 has started spreading in the U.S. and impacting the economy there, we see that spike slow and start to level off. And in the last couple of weeks, we see that prices have even fallen a little. And so during this time, as COVID-19 has started to impact the economy in the U.S., there's been a drop in demand for goods coming out of China and towards the U.S. Consumer demand in the U.S. has dropped. Big enterprise shippers were canceling orders or trying to delay receiving orders they had ordered before, after China had recovered, but before the impact was being felt in the U.S. itself. And so as consumer demand is dropping, we're seeing that leveling off, or now that's dropping. So in response to that dropping demand, ocean carriers were canceling a record number of sailings just through the last couple of weeks to reduce ocean freight capacity and to match it with the dropping demand for freight, which has kept ocean prices from collapsing so far. So what does this mean for importers? This means obviously you might be seeing a drop in sales as consumer demand is dropping for lots of different categories of goods at the moment. But for products still in demand, like household items or protective gear, or medical supplies, or other things that are still in demand, maybe trampolines. The ports in China are operational. And in the US as well, logistics and ports are still moving. So there might be some delay in how quickly shipments can travel by ocean, as there are fewer ships, but ocean really is operational. And as we've seen, for now, prices are level or even starting to dip a bit. And even though we've seen this rise towards through March, it's important to remember that at the moment, these prices are lower than they were in 2019 at the same time. And of course, dropping demand, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, could also mean dropping ocean rates as well. So this is something that remains to be seen if you have items that are currently in demand. If we go to the next slide, please. If we go and look at air cargo, the story is different. So passenger flights have been canceled out of China since the end of January, or a large proportion of passenger flights. And from Europe towards the U.S. and other locations as well, there's been a big reduction in the volume of passenger flights that are traveling, either because of travel restrictions or because of a big drop in demand for passenger travel. And this is important for air cargo because normally about half of of air cargo travels by passenger jet. And so imports out of Europe going towards the U.S., that percentage is even higher. It's about 60%. So with all this passenger flights canceled, there's been a big impact on the amount of air cargo capacity that's available. And at the same time, there's been a demand spike for sensitive goods, such as personal protective equipment, medical supplies, things like that different countries, including the U.S., need to contend with the virus itself. Next slide, please. So we have this combination of lack of capacity as well as a spike in demand for time-sensitive goods. And so drastic times have called for drastic measures. Here we have an image from Lufthansa of a passenger plane being used as a freighter, as a cargo plane. We see cargo being loaded right in the main deck. There are even some airlines now that are removing the seats to allow for more space for cargo on the main deck. So in the first couple weeks after the Chinese recovery, in March, it wasn't uncommon for rates for air cargo to double or triple within the first couple of weeks, or even day to day at first. Last week, there was an additional 30 to 50% spike in express rates out of China. And what we're seeing is a really high rates for air cargo now. In terms of rates coming out of Europe, they seem to be leveling off while remaining high, whereas even last week there were continued to be increases from China as there have been some additional reduction of passenger capacity there. So these rates are likely to stay high as long as there's still a need for these critical goods. So if you're not dealing in high demand goods during the crisis, it's likely that air would be an expensive option. Air would definitely be an expensive option, but it's possible to book air even so. So air cargo is still moving. Again, there's a capacity crunch, but air cargo is still moving and it can still be booked. It is possible there'll be some delays, and Ari is going to speak about this more in a little bit. The situation is volatile. Some freight forwarders are offering expedited or premium ocean services to accommodate shippers that are being priced out of air. So guaranteeing space or offering shorter sailing times in order to accommodate people who have been priced out of air. If we go to the next slide, please. So if we now turn to what the impact on logistics has been kind of domestically, if we're looking at the US and in Europe. So, of course, multiple states in the US have had different shutdown directives of different varying severity. I know, for example, Utah last week was requiring people to entering the state to self-quarantine for 2 weeks upon entering, and there have been many other states that have different types of directives like that. In Europe, they've closed borders between countries for cross-border passenger travel or for individuals. But for all these different restrictions, there have been exemptions for logistics. So logistics have been categorized as an essential service and therefore exempt from any kind of restrictions. So if we take trucking, for example, there have been no real disruptions. So in Europe, for example, they've designated special green lanes for trucks and just to continue through. Of course, there have been some delays, but things are still moving. In the US as well, there's been this shift to essential goods only. So trucking has somewhat been unbalanced as you have your capacity spread out all over the country, but now you're trying to focus on just certain categories of goods or certain verticals. There have also been reports of delays in loading or unloading at different both ports or warehouses and things like that, as some of the workforce has been impacted by the virus. So there have been some delays, but things are definitely still moving. In terms of ports, there's been some concern about pileups of goods coming in from China that shippers no longer want, but there are big steps being taken out to deal with that, to make sure there are no bottlenecks and to make sure that as new goods are coming through, they're able to be processed and moved along. And then finally, or finally for me, this shift to essential goods in the US is also being felt in other ways. So Amazon has been really hustling to keep up with the surge in e-commerce demand and e-commerce orders during the shutdown, and on the focus of these essential or household goods. So one example of that change or accommodation is that on March 17th, which was week 12, Amazon announced it was suspending accepting shipments of non-essential items to its warehouses by third-party sellers or fulfillment by Amazon sellers, FBAs, so that it could focus only on supplying essential goods. So the graph we're looking at here looks at the number of FBA sellers that booked a freight shipment on Freightos.com. And we see a similar story to the ocean rates that we looked at earlier on. We see a high number of shipments ahead of Chinese New Year towards the left of the graph, a lull during the Chinese shutdown and recovery in March rebounded. But then in week 13, where it says policy change, when that policy went into effect that they were no longer accepting non-essential items to their warehouses from third-party sellers, we saw a drop in shipments for 2 weeks. Amazon ended that restriction a month later, which was week 16, the last bar in this graph, and we see the rebound of shipments there. But interestingly, a week prior, in week 15, we also saw a rebound. It looked like FBA shipments had already recovered. And this might point to savvy FBAs succeeding in pivoting quickly and switching to selling goods that are in demand or essential goods. And that's an interesting indication of some resilience or flexibility there. And we've seen Amazon also making other adjustments, so suspending Amazon shipping services, which was their last mile service that they were providing to third-party sellers, which will start in June, to focus on this high demand coming from their own customers. And also that they announced that Amazon Prime Day would be delayed until August, as again, they're kind of focusing on these core goods. So this is also something interesting that we want to keep an eye on. So the market data shows a lot of volatility in terms of what's happened so far. And it leaves us with a lot of questions of what will happen next, more than, unfortunately, clear answers that we can give. But with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ari Corman, who will share some practical tips on how to manage freight during this crisis. And he'll, of course, also address how to adjust to these Amazon developments as well.
Great. Thank you, Judah. And thank you, Jamin. And nice to see, by the way, that the number of participants is increasing as we go along. So I guess everyone's finding the information very, very helpful. And just to remind everyone that you can drop any questions in the Q&A section or chat if you face any technical difficulties. We will get to as many questions as possible the last third of this session. So just to introduce myself, my name is Ari Corman, Vice President of Sales and Customer Success at Freightos. I've been with the company now for about 7 years, so very excited to be with everyone today. I just want to, before I begin my presentation, just to kind of give everyone a sense of reassurance. Just like this kind of pandemic has kind of caught the world by surprise, it doesn't necessarily have the kind of equal impact on shipping. Shipping, in many ways, is actually right now relatively stable, and with a minimum amount of disruption, and if navigated correctly, really is something that is doable, manageable. We're seeing customers booking every single day, actually increasing numbers of people booking every single day. So there are definitely ways, and we'll get to these in a few minutes, to kind of navigate the situation and prepare you, for how to handle the crisis effectively. So what I'm going to begin doing is just to set the scene a little bit in terms of challenges that are facing the customers that we speak to. And this is based on, speaking to customers every single day in our organization, as well as speaking to many of our service providers, the freight forwarders and carriers that we work with. So this is based on real, conversations, real customers and providers. So I'm going to briefly outline some specific challenges around pricing, operations, and regulations. And then I'm going to go into some very practical tips, again, specifically around pricing and freight cost, operational things to consider, regulations, and then some of the kind of realities of just working from home and how to navigate things online and kind of going digital. So if we go to the next slide, just to outline some specifics in pricing. So as Judah mentioned, we are seeing a tightening in air capacity, and this is really across the entire supply chain, right? Going down from the airlines to the freight forwarders or freight brokers, down to the end customers, the end importers and exporters. So that's a challenge to be aware of, that we are in a tightening market for airspace, and this is due to the fact that China continues to implement many restrictions and a lot of flights getting bumped. And we'll discuss, again, don't get nervous, we're going to discuss some tips of how to deal with that effectively in just a few minutes. Also, in terms of pricing, there's not just the issue of tightening capacity, but we are seeing restrictions on weight. So that means the actual maximum weight that you may be allowed to ship in one time. So if you're looking to ship a few thousand kilos or even a few hundred kilos, you may be given very specific restrictions per shipment in terms of what you're allowed to ship, again, due to the tightened capacity. Let's just briefly discuss some challenges operationally. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see, you'll start to see, sorry, getting ahead of myself. Just another point here as well to consider that although we are seeing a significant increase, or because of the tightened capacity, an increase in pricing again across the industry in both air freight and express, and that's the second chart here in the bottom right. There's also a positive, which is that importers are willing to pay more and want to pay more for the goods that they're ultimately selling. So the fact that people are paying more given the market realities, even if it's in small quantities for their express or air, there is kind of I guess a positive aspect of that as well. We are seeing that kind of across all modes that pricing is actually quite stable, and this is it's not really a challenge, but actually just a reality. We're seeing a very significant increase as well, specifically in LCL, less than full container loads. So we've seen actually an increase of about 15 to 20% over the last 3 weeks in terms of customer shipping by ocean freight, specifically less than full container loads. So that has actually stabilized the overall price that our customers have been paying for their freight, kind of balancing out some of the increases on express. And we'll talk about that again after the challenges and some practical tips of how you could potentially ship smaller quantities by express, again more expensive, and larger quantities by ocean freight to balance that out. So if we go to the next slide, some highlights in terms of operational challenges that you should be aware of. So China is largely back. Factories are now already producing. There might be some backlog in production. I know that Jamin and his team in Alibaba will be more than happy to, they've got a lot of great resources specifically around this in terms of finding the right suppliers and which suppliers are producing and what's back. But China largely is back. The delays are really more now at the destination side. And although in the US, unfortunately, there are kind of some inconsistencies depending on the specific states, as opposed to kind of one blanket rule. And again, I'm discussing that in terms of the US. The same would apply in Canada and also in Western Europe in terms of different countries having, or different provinces and cities having different ordinances. But we are seeing delays in the sense that many small importers may not have their own warehouse, or they may be subject to work from home procedures. So even if the logistics companies are not affected in the sense that they are considered essential, and the ports and the trucking companies are considered essential, if you're a small business who is not allowed to operate your store or even your own warehouse, then there may be delays in terms of receiving cargo. So that's where some of the delays may come into play. Also in terms of customs clearance, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you should just be aware of some of the challenges around sensitive cargo, items especially around PPE that might be subject to FDA, and some increased custom holds or time that things are held in customs. And that, unfortunately can impact things like storage, warehousing, and other charges as well. So again, some challenges. It's always good to be realistic and to know what's going on in the market. So why don't we briefly go to the next the slide. We're seeing some challenges in Amazon. I know that many of you Alibaba customers are Amazon sellers or e-commerce sellers in general, and thankfully Amazon actually has largely stabilized. I just spoke to one of our freight forwarders on the Freightos on the Alibaba Freight powered by Freightos marketplace, and they shared with me that Amazon is now accepting all cargo, and we've heard this from some Amazon sellers as well directly. So not only has Amazon published that, but it's been confirmed on the ground that some of these items are less of a risk. So that's worth, that challenge seems to become less of a challenge right now, that Amazon is going back to normal. Okay, and then obviously, because you're all working from home, or maybe some of you are not, but you're balancing a lot of things. And this is just, kind of an industry-wide thing that we're all balancing. And I think you'll see and appreciate some of the tips that I'll share in terms of how to actually take advantage of the fact in terms of shipping, what you can do now in this kind of online age, and some of the digital resources that are available to you to kind of manage your shipments. So I'm going to just pause for a second before we go into some of the practical tips, just to kind of remind everybody that I know there are probably a lot of questions, so feel free to start posting them in the Q&A section, and we'll get back to it. We'll get to as many as possible in the last 20 minutes or so of the webinar. We're also recording this webinar for anyone that wants to listen in the future. If you want to do some jumping jacks, you want to have a shot of espresso, that's also fine. So why don't we go ahead, Ethan, and we're going to go into now some specific tips during the COVID-19 crisis that we're all in. So as I promised, we're going to start with some pricing. And pricing is usually the first thing that people talk about, which is kind of ironic because from my standpoint, when I train new sales reps or new customer service reps, the first thing I tell them is never talk about price, never talk about cost, talk about reliability, talk about predictability. And that's really actually in many ways what's most important in terms of how to actually manage your costs. It's not just finding a cheap quote, not just finding the rock bottom a quote from the cheapest provider, but really about reliability, predictability, and those things in the end will ensure actually that you save money. So that's going to be an important point just to consider anything you do, right? Finding a supplier, booking the right freight shipment, considering the right modes. So let me go through some of these. These are very important points to control your costs. As we've said now, avoid air shipments if at all possible. Plan in advance to enable ocean shipping. So ocean shipping is quite stable. We've seen some specific service providers through Alibaba Freight, powered by Freightos, some specific freight forwarders who are offering now some very, very good transit time, direct consolidation shipments from the major ports in China like Shenzhen, Shanghai, direct to New York, direct to LA, even to Chicago. And this means that some of the ocean services available now are quicker and more direct. So as much as possible, try to plan slightly in advance for ocean shipping. It's also important just from a business standpoint, freight is just another line item that you can't avoid, but you need to consider as part of your overall cost, right? So what kind of goods are you actually selling? What kinds of questions are you asking yourself in terms of, what am I sourcing? What is interesting, right? Goods that may have been interesting 3 or 6 months ago are not interesting now. That might be because, I don't know, certain verticals are not selling, or, clothing might not be interesting, whereas other home goods might be more interesting. So make sure that not only are you sourcing, and this might be obvious to you, but make sure that the goods you're selling are actually attractive and that you will achieve a profitable per unit cost in what you're sourcing, including the line item for freight, right? So don't just think, oh, wow, what a great deal per unit that I'm sourcing from my supplier, but build in the freight cost to that overall per unit kind of analysis that you're doing about what you're shipping or what you're looking to sell and how shipping feeds into that. Okay. And just another interesting anecdote, that we hear. We've had some customers now that that we've been working with now for many years, and there's nothing wrong with kind of during this period also using sourcing or looking for new suppliers. You may find that you may actually save cost by sourcing from a factory or from a new supplier who has cargo, who is quicker to produce, or may have a higher quality and quicker turnaround, which may also then feed into a lower shipping cost. So this is a time to also be kind of creative and potentially look at different options to kind of maximize what you're doing. So let's just go through some tips around operations. Like I mentioned in challenges, a lot of this really comes down to planning. I think in the Q&A section, many of you are going to ask. We usually get questions around when should I actually book my freight, and it's really important to consider that and to be as close as possible. Not too close so that's late, but obviously about 1 or 2 weeks prior to the final goods ready date to actually book your freight. This will ensure that you don't have issues around additional charges or issues with rate validity, where like the quote you're booking then ends up going into next rate validity, trying to avoid some of those kinds of pitfalls. Also communication, right? So proactively communicating once you actually book your shipment to make sure that you get updates in terms of, okay, when is my cargo going to be picked up? When can I expect it to depart from the port? When do I expect it to arrive at its destination port? And that's an important thing. You can't plan too early, especially as there's a lot of unemployment issues in many countries, including in the, obviously in the U.S. and Western Europe. That you need to plan ahead to make sure that you have the resources, the human resources, to actually aid in receiving the cargo. As I alluded to in some of the challenges earlier, if you're not able to receive cargo, or maybe your employees are currently furloughed or no longer, you may need to plan a different way, a different final destination to ship to. And these are very practical things to consider, right? Where am I shipping to? Do I have the resources to help unload the cargo? And then ensuring that you have an idea of the transit times and when to actually make those decisions, and plan ahead for the dates that you need that. By the way, no penalties for the 8 people that have dropped off over the last 10 minutes, but I promise you it's worth staying for the second half of this webinar as we go into continue with some of the tips and then go into the Q&A. So why don't we go to the next slide, Ethan? Okay, and regulations are very crucial. We discussed Amazon because many of you are Amazon sellers, and how they've changed their rules quite frequently. But there's also things that are, the customs, U.S. Customs, for example, has gone back and forth now at least 3 or 4 times over the last 3 weeks on offering deferred duties regulations or deferred duties payments. So that's a big deal. Those those could be potentially thousands of dollars that don't need to be paid necessarily prior to cargo arrival date, but actually can be deferred for 30, 60, or even 90 days. Again, not in all cases, and these things are changing frequently, but definitely adapt to the changing regulations. There's a lot of things going on now, especially as new laws are being passed in many countries, including in the U.S., to assist small businesses. There are loans going through the SBA authority to small businesses, and there are even new regulations regarding deferred duties. And then there are many, many other examples of different regulations to pay attention to. And then specifically the kinds of cargo to avoid. We've seen some difficult cases, and you're not going to see this, obviously, if you're working already with Alibaba, who do an excellent job in ensuring that you're working with quality suppliers. They have very good, ratings and feedback and transparency to ensure that you're working with reputable, transparent suppliers. But we have seen, kind of in the larger industry, importers that have been burned importing from less than reputable suppliers who may not have the correct documentations, who may not have advised that, for example, alcohol gel, which is sometimes considered a PPE or a kind of part of that, and that may be subject to additional charges or additional documentation. So be very careful that you're working obviously with a reputable supplier, and that you then do have the required documents, especially if subject to FDA, and to avoid things that might be deemed hazardous and therefore subject to additional charges. I can go on this slide. There's a lot of information. And just a general call out, I see the Q&A number is rising. Check out, just become educated. Go online, check out, obviously, Alibaba, Freightos, Journal of Commerce, and any other logistics sites to be very, to be as knowledgeable as possible about what's going on. Just a final set of tips, and then we'll just we're going to wrap it up with a quick kind of view of Alibaba Freight and what actually the website, the platform actually looks like. So just a final tip: go online, go digital. Obviously, you're not going anywhere, right? I know it's raining outside in New York City today. It's really sunny. You're not going anywhere, right? So go online, use the platforms that are available. Look at maybe doing things differently. Maybe instead of calling people and looking in the phone book, actually go online. There are a lot of resources available in terms of how you can track shipments, how you can proactively communicate with different freight providers, whether it's customs brokers, freight forwarders, trucking companies, looking up tracking online. A lot of stuff is available online, either in Alibaba Freight or just in general. And if you're looking at different tools, I don't just mean tracking for your own shipment, but I mean things like fulfillment, right? Or like I just described in terms of regulations and other platforms that may aid you if you're like a multi-channel e-commerce seller, right? So you may want to explore some new platforms for e-commerce fulfillment and some other things. Okay, so that's just a kind of a final set of tips. I know that's a little bit general, but just kind of embrace as opposed to kind of push back. And we find that having a positive attitude and seeing that the world is changing. And by the way, even after things go back to normal, we're in a new reality. And I do believe that what Alibaba and what Freightos are doing in terms of kind of adapting to the new realities of how to source online, how to move freight online, will continue and will continue to kind of grow even as we go back into the kind of the new normal. So just consider that you're kind of 2 steps ahead if you're already online doing this stuff. Okay, good. So some jumping jacks, some push-ups, some sit-ups. I can't hear anyone laughing. Maybe no one is. Okay, good. So now we're going to go into some this is going to be 2 minutes. I promised that we were going to have the last 2/3 of the webinar dedicated to your questions, and we will honor our commitments. And with that, I will just show you very, very briefly Alibaba.com. So on the next slide, you'll see that it's very easy. All you need to do is, on the next slide, put in your origin, destination, load details, specify if you're shipping loose cargo like boxes, pallets, or full containers. Very easy. It's really just 4 or 5 inputs, and then you click search and you get quotes. Off to the races. And the next slide, you actually will then quickly see within 20, 30 seconds many tens of freight options from many different freight forwarders and service providers. You can filter by all the kinds of standard things if you're used to the Expedias of the world, right? You can compare by freight forwarders. You can talk about carriers. You can talk about transit times. You can look at reviews. You can read up on the specific service providers. You can see how many shipments they've done. So that's very important, right? So if you see it like the second service provider, for example, that has 570 reviews, they have 1,000 plus shipments, they have a quote of X, and you're able to balance kind of price, transit time, and like I said before, it's not just about cheapest, but it's about reliability and it's about predictability in terms of managing your shipments. And then once you book your shipment through the platform, you're taken to, and this is just a breakdown of the quote, you're able to manage your shipments directly online. So you can see here your TA number, your trade assurance number. You can see here your purchase order. You can download this to Excel. You can sort by shipment status. And this is really a free platform where you can manage all of your shipments in one location, giving yourself that reliability to know when is your stuff coming in, when can you plan for arrival date, etc. And then finally, this is the final slide. You're able to not only manage your shipments, but you're also able to proactively communicate both with your service provider as well as the Freightos, on the next slide, the Freightos customer service team. So this gives you the ability to manage your shipment, upload documents, review documents, chat with your freight forwarder. The next slide has shows you what the communication messenger looks like, and this is obviously an easy way to speak with your service provider, regardless of the hour. You don't need to necessarily call them up, and you have all the information at your fingertips. So I hope this was beneficial. I think it was. And just to summarize, we discussed some of the challenges, some very, very practical tips, as well as a very brief kind of overview of the Alibaba Freight powered by Freightos platform. So I'm just going to hand it over back to Jamin at Alibaba to kind of wrap things up, summarize some of what we discussed today, and then go to hear your questions. So go ahead, Jamin.
Great. Thanks, Ari. So that was very helpful. I think it'd be helpful at this point to jump straight to questions because I see a number of them here. Ethan, do you have an order? Do you want to go in here? We can start to jump into them and answer some of these. Are you there?
Sorry about that. I was muted. Yeah, so I see a bunch of questions coming in here. Going to try to prioritize them. I guess first question coming in for Ari. What if my supplier is handling the freight for my international imports? Are the challenges the same?
So I'm just let me just look here.
I don't know if Ari heard. Ari, did you?
Yeah, I'm back. I just had to unmute. Why don't we repeat the question just so everybody?
Yeah. So if somebody has asked if my supplier is what if my supplier is handling the freight for my international imports? Are the challenges the same?
Sure. And that's a consideration that we hear from all of our customers, or many customers who are looking at their suppliers who have offered to potentially handle the freight for them. And we do recommend that if you're shipping a very small parcel, like like a sample item, maybe one carton or something, definitely no harm in using your supplier. They do have good relationships with the courier companies, the Chinese equivalent or Southeast Asian equivalents, or even FedEx, DHL, UPS. But when it comes to larger shipments, especially by ocean, and definitely if going to kind of an Amazon warehouse, or once you start including additional requirements through customs clearance and getting to the final destination, not just to the port, there are some potential risks in doing that with your supplier. The suppliers usually are able to get things either very small, like through a courier, or terminating at a port, like Los Angeles, New York, even some of the inland ramps, or if we're talking about Canada or Western Europe. But they're not as skilled usually in getting things through customs, and then also handling the final final leg in delivery from port or ramp to door, and especially around things like Amazon or other fulfillment, where there might be additional requirements around palletizing, labeling, delivery appointments, and things like that. So it's a great question. I can talk about it in more detail and be happy to after the call, or via Alibaba Freight. But the bottom line is that for small courier shipments, it's fine. For larger shipments, and with those with more complexities, it would be recommended not to, and to potentially use like an Alibaba Freight.
Hey,
thanks, Ari. Oh,
yeah,
sorry about that.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jamin.
Add one thing to that. I think it's a really important question, and there can be a lot of benefits to supplier managing the freight for you, but there's nothing quite as I think clarifying as being able to see lots of different quotes at once. And I think it's important at this time when pricing is so volatile, it's important to know that you're getting an apples to apples comparison, and that you're getting something that is a fair price. And so that's one thing that a lot of buyers are starting to, I think, focus on is, it used to be $3 a kilo, now it's $20 a kilo. How do I know that I'm comparing like for like quotes? So I think it's important to have a tool at your disposal that can help with that.
Thanks. And Jamin, if they're ready, have you on for that. Got another question. How do I know if a supplier on Alibaba is reputable, or are they all pre-approved somehow?
That's great. That's a great question. So suppliers on Alibaba go through a number of different verification procedures with our own internal team. We've got several different ways of doing that. We look at the local registration of the factory or the manufacturer, and we actually have people who do on-site visits and inspect the factories. We have different levels of checking for financial viability, and you can see that on Alibaba.com. A trade assurance is a service that we provide, which a supplier in China has to qualify for that, and it brings with it a certain level of knowledge about how reliable they are. But it is an area of question for a lot of people who are just getting into cross-border trade, because it can feel like trying to do business in the Wild West. But I think the different verification methods that we have really helped people rest more easy in trading with a partner in China.
Thanks, Jamin. Judah, I think this next question is for you, a little cerebral. How do oil prices in the U.S., which are at historical lows, impact everything from ocean rates, air cargo rates, and even demand to import? And should BCOs, so large shippers, forget about any worries of low sulfur diesel surcharges?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So I guess, first of all, just maybe to bring some people up to speed, um, at the beginning of the year, on January 1st, a regulation went into effect from the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is an office of the UN, that made it necessary for ocean carriers or for ships to use a less polluting type of fuel called low sulfur fuel oil. And this was kind of before COVID hit. This was the big story in the industry. Low sulfur fuel oil was more expensive than regular oil or heavy fuel oil, and so there was a lot of talk and concern that this was going to be an additional expense for carriers that was going to be passed on to shippers. So what's happened with the oil market in general, there's been kind of a big drop in demand as China was shut down and as other countries are shutting down, as well as now we have this glut of supply happening as well, which has pushed oil prices down. Even before that, there was some indications that low sulfur fuel oil wasn't going to be as expensive as was expected. All else being equal, yes, the situation in the oil markets does make ocean and air less expensive because the costs are lower. But I think the story right now is really about demand, and so even if that component of it would make ocean freight, for example, less expensive, the real drivers of rates at the moment are demand for freight. So I think in ocean, what we're going to see is going to be driven by demand. Once things even out or recover, it's possible that rates will be less expensive than they otherwise would have been because of the fuel component. And I think this is going to be true for air as well. In other words, the air industry has really taken a hit from the drop in demand, and the industry as a whole is looking for part of this governmental stimulus. And I think the oil concerns are going to be secondary until things kind of even out, and then we'll see where oil prices are then.
Okay, thanks, Judah. Ari, I would say this next one is for you. Someone says that they've been in business for a couple of years, but until now they focus predominantly on doing domestic sourcing. Do you think this is a bad time to jump into the waters for international importing? Does it make sense to try to ride the wave out before really jumping in and starting to import overseas during COVID?
Yeah, it's a great question, and many are asking the same thing if they have kind of traditionally imported from China and they were saying, okay, can we diversify to Southeast Asia or maybe India? So this is a fantastic question. We generally do recommend to our customers to just diversify. I guess within the U.S. There is some more predictability than shipping internationally. That being said, there are many advantages to shipping internationally, and some things come up. For example, when countries come back online, for example, even China, where many were saying, okay, well, let's diversify. Let's now, maybe source in Southeast Asia. All of a sudden, the Chinese government specifically is trying to kind of ramp up trade again in exports, and specifically trying to encourage trade between, for example, China and Western Europe. And all of a sudden, you find that freight actually can be quite inexpensive. So there are, and I know the question was specifically around the U.S., but the larger point is just that things change, and there is really no harm in kind of diversifying. So if you've kind of traditionally sourced domestically, and I'll broaden that, if you've sourced only from China, I would definitely recommend, if it's only domestic, international. If it's only China, also consider Southeast Asia or India or even Europe, because there are some advantages, whether it's regulatory, whether it's pricing, whether it's operations, that may be benefited from. And even some of our larger customers, by the way, just anecdotally, we have a large furniture company that we work with who import many hundreds of containers annually, who are importing, I think, 80% plus from China, have now diversified and are importing also from Malaysia, also from Vietnam, and they actually are now also sourcing domestically. through kind of some new wholesalers and distributors. So they're actually now beginning to source somewhat domestically. So I guess the bottom line is to diversify, I would say, is the correct answer to that question.
Thanks, Ari. Just trying to keep everybody here on their feet. Jamin, coming back to you, do you find that with some U.S. companies producing goods that are not typical, like face masks and ventilators, that shippers are now running into logistics or regulatory issues that they're not familiar with because it's a new product?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is a very challenging time for people who are trying to bring personal protective equipment into the U.S. And partly it's just the U.S. government is trying to, on the one side, make it easier to get those products in, but also on the other side, there's some confusion out there because there's lots of updates to what can be successfully cleared at the border. So it is not a time to be trying this for the first time. Probably this is pretty advanced stuff right now because the rules change quite frequently. So I think it would be normal to hear from people who are having trouble getting PPE equipment in. We do see that there is product coming in. The biggest issue right now is availability. And I see another question here about the U.S. government and their buying up air capacity. I don't know that that's the issue as much as it's just trying to find product that is available and can be cleared in the U.S. But it's something that Alibaba is working on and many others are working on. So I hope that answers that question. But that's kind of the state of play right now for PPE.
Thanks. Judah, going back to you about the freight data, which was a little bit China-centric. Somebody who is looking into expanding the countries from which they source their products, which of the challenges that you mentioned are unique to China and which apply to other countries as well?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to add for the previous question about the fuel oil. There are carriers who have already canceled the surcharge. So some carriers had a surcharge for that fuel oil. So CMA, CGM, for example, canceled their surcharge, which will be in effect in May. In terms of other countries, so if the question is in terms of the impact of the pandemic in different countries, so it really varies country to country. So in terms of China, as we mentioned, really the recovery has been pretty dramatic since the end of January. But otherwise, it's really on a country by country basis. So if we're talking about Asia Pacific, India currently is very hard hit. They're having major disruptions in logistics, both at ports and also in roads. So things are really hard hit there. South Korea, is pretty much lauded for managing the crisis very well. They're having more constraints in terms of air cargo capacity, which is kind of intra-Asia is also feeling the pinch there. Otherwise, things are operational. And another example is in the Philippines, there are some disruptions at ports due to the workforce being impacted. So it really depends on a country-to-country basis. And there are a lot of good resources out there to look at what's going on in specific countries. And actually, at Freightos, we have put together a resources page which kind of has a bunch of different links to different great resources out there that can give you a lot of information on specific countries if that's what you're after.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, Judah. We are nearing the end of the time here, so I'm going to hand it back to Jamin to wrap this up. One last question kind of to hand over to him on the way out. Jamin, I understand that Alibaba basically deals with Chinese companies. I'd like to become a supplier in Alibaba, but the factories that I represent are located in Brazil and Mexico. Is it possible to do business through Alibaba?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have opened up the platform in the past few years to suppliers and sellers from all over the world. And we can definitely, if you contact us, we will help you out. And many of the people who help put this call together, this webinar together, can help directly with that. So that's a great question. I know that we're up against the clock here. So if we didn't get to your question, we will do our best to respond to each one. But overall, I hope that this has been helpful. We've been speaking with small businesses on a daily basis. In fact, internally, it's a requirement that we talk to our customers on a regular basis. And what we are hearing from them, the ones that are succeeding in this challenging period of time is the ones who are succeeding are taking action to learn what's happening in the freight market, much as each of you are with this webinar, but they're also trying out new ways to take control of their business. They're re-engaging in trade by understanding where the risks are and trying to avoid them rather than just sitting on the sidelines. So I think proactivity is really the key message in restarting business in this challenging time. So and a big part of that is shifting away from analog methods and more into digital so that you can manage the risks a little bit more scientifically and be able to have visibility to your supply chain. So the key takeaways here, I think, that I wrote down were suppliers in China and all over the world are coming back online. Ocean freight lanes are generally online and working pretty well. There's still lots of variability in the air market, where we're seeing rates that are sometimes 5, 6, or 7 times higher than normal. So it's important to stay educated and work with people who are full-time staying close to what's happening in the industry. So that's a bit about what we've been working on. I hope it's been helpful to you, and we're looking forward to connecting with each of you separately. To stay informed of our upcoming Alibaba.com resources and events, just follow us at alibaba.com/buildup, and we'll be seeing you shortly. Thanks everybody. Appreciate your time today.